The vast inland forests of Bay of Plenty blanket the earth as far as the eye can see. They cover the land and hold tightly to many secrets. On the 6th of December 1956, deep in the Whirinaki forest, a car was found, abandoned. The driver's door was wide open. A cup of tea sat cold on the floor. The keys were gone. Pat Fisk, the driver, was missing and has never been seen again.
Oh, he was so good looking. He was lovely. He was a real family man. He loved the kids. When he got back from work, he'd take them down to the river for a swim. We were just so happy. I met Pat in India, first when I was 17. He was tall and dark and brown eyes, just warm brown eyes. We fell in love and I got married when I was 19. He was in the Indian police. We lived in Baluchistan, which is on the borders of Afghanistan. He covered 500 square miles. I don't know that I would have called him an adventurer. He just knew what he wanted to do and he went ahead and did it. And he was very capable and competent and very bright, and he worked everything out. When we came to New Zealand, one of the questions was how much were we prepared to pay for a passage. And this made Pat furious because it sounded as if you'd have to bribe them to get on a ship. And he said, I'd rather buy my own boat and sail there. And I said, well, why don't we? Neither of us had ever been on a boat in our lives. Pat did a course in navigation and seamanship. It was a 10-day course in a little sailing dinghy with an old retired naval commander.
Pat and Maureen bought the Debonair, a 34-foot yacht, and the intrepid pair headed off with their 2 small children to the other side of the world.
It took 17 months. But we weren't sailing all the time. We picked the best time for the weather for each area, avoiding the hurricane season.
In November 1950, the Debonair sailed into Tauranga Harbour. The Fisks were looking forward to a settled life in a new country. And for a short while, that was what they had.
In those days, Tauranga was really quite a little place and not much work available at all. But the harbour master befriended us and he said, well, he could give Pat a job working with the harbour board crew.
Pat's job as a labourer was a far cry from commanding a troop of policemen. So when the Inland Revenue Department opened a new branch in Tauranga in 1952, Pat took a job there.
He was investigation officer. The group was specially selected to have a facility and got away from the main occupation of most of those in the office, about 100, which was putting this bit of paper with that bit of paper with the other bit of paper with this bit of paper, whatever it is.
The Fisks bought a 5-acre section, and the ever-resourceful Pat built the family a new house. By 1956, Pat and Maureen had 4 children and were expecting their 5th.
He was just happy with what we had. Our own orchard, plenty of work out in the orchard, and the kids growing up. It was a good life for us.
We had an idyllic lifestyle property with a little river down one side, the fresh water we could swim in, room for a horse, I just remember a very happy time as a child there.
Pat Fisk's work for the IRD often took him out of town. His job was to track down tax evaders. While not considered hazardous, there was always the risk of coming up against serious criminals.
He went out and investigated with difficult files or missing taxpayers or anything like that. That was his main job.
On Wednesday, the 5th of December 1956, Pat headed off on a routine work trip for the Kaingaroa forest area.
He just really had his clothes he was in and a change of shirt, because he was only going for a night or at the most 2 nights.
But what began as an ordinary day would ultimately change the Fisk family forever. Pat arrived in the IRD car for his first appointment at 11:30, where he met quarry manager Reg Hobson. His car left the quarry at 12 noon and was seen passing through Murupara Township at around 12:30. This was believed to be the last known sighting of Pat Fisk. When he failed to return on Friday as scheduled, his wife Maureen began to worry.
Then on Sunday, somebody from the department rang up and said the car had been seen abandoned on the Waikari Moana Road. And they had requested a police investigation.
It was established that hunters had first seen Pat's car abandoned at 4 a.m. on Thursday morning. The Vauxhall Velox was at a secluded lookout off Highway 38 between Murupara and Waikiri Moana.
The local people were bewildered. They couldn't understand all the police investigations at the time. They did the search. A lot of the locals went up with their search and rescue to look around the hills, and I think they were there for about 3, maybe 4 days, searching the bush, nothing. And they were qualified good bushmen.
Oh, it was a terrible time. A terrible time. Just not knowing what had happened to him.
Maureen's parents, Colonel and Mrs. Carpendale, who were visiting New Zealand, comforted her. But she became distressed when the police search was called off.
Because at that time I thought he might have had an accident. Our friends, our wonderful friends, organised a search party. We went up with tents and we camped at the summit. We searched the whole area absolutely thoroughly.
But all inquiries and searches turned up nothing. Pat Fisk had simply vanished. Tax investigator Pat Fisk's car was found abandoned at the Tarapanamu summit. News that Pat was missing spread fast.
It was quite a big event, and of course newspaper items and everybody putting their theories across and much discussion over coffee and, yes, as to what happened.
With no clues as to Pat's whereabouts, people speculated that his disappearance could be linked to anything from smuggling rings to romantic liaisons or even murder.
I knew he was dead. If he was alive, he would have been at home.
Looking back at Pat's actions prior to his disappearance, there was one unusual occurrence. Pat had originally planned to go away in the second week of December, when he suddenly told Maureen he had to leave immediately.
I have a feeling it was probably all involved with this ring bolting thing, because he had told me months before that he thought there was a definite racket whereby criminals could escape the country, and he was, keen to investigate it.
Ring bolting was the practice of hiding people away on ships to illegally get them out of the country. Although this was not in his area of investigation, Pat did have a police background.
Well, I believe he told his boss in the department that this is what he was interested in doing. And he said, oh, well, OK, but just be careful.
On Wednesday, the 5th of December, Pat cancelled the accommodation he'd arranged for the following week, collected his files, and left in the IRD car. He said he would book new accommodation when he reached Murupara. At 11:30, Pat arrived at the Peki quarry in the Kaingaroa forest. Here he talked to quarry manager Reg Hobson for 20 minutes and discovered that Hobson owed a small amount of tax to the IRD. Hobson later told police they'd also discussed ring bolting, with Fisk saying to Hobson, "I understand you're next on the list to ring bolt." Hobson denied this, but told police that Fisk appeared interested in ring bolting for himself. The original search for Pat Fisk found no body, no trace of him, and few clues. Police at the time believed that Pat Fisk had staged his own disappearance, and some people who knew Pat believe this is what happened.
He didn't go without thinking about it first. I think that's what you have to see from Pat, that he was a thinking man. He realised situations before they happened and probably sat there thinking about what he would do about it. He wouldn't go back to Britain. Australia only because it would be near and big and lots of people, and it wouldn't be Britain.
But Maureen and her family dispute that Pat would have absconded.
That's crazy. I mean, if he had wanted to go, he had his own boat in the harbour. He could have said, I feel I need a bit of time out, and just pulled up the anchor and gone. But he would never have done it like that if he had wanted to go.
The Fisk family also point to a passage in a book Pat wrote about sailing to New Zealand to illustrate his commitment to his family.
How fortunate we were to be there at all, and how much more fortunate to have all the family there together. God grant that we be allowed to get them safely to New Zealand, there to remain a united family. They at once seemed to be worth untold risk and hardship, and in comparison all else seemed worthless.
However, in his 1957 police report, Senior Detective Angus Sharp concluded that Pat had almost certainly abandoned his family. Sharp based this on his opinion that Pat was a most unusual character.
Various people describe him as moody, difficult to get to know. It's quite apparent that no one knew him particularly well, with the exception maybe of his family.
He was a very reserved person, and he didn't have a great many friends, perhaps. His life just was with the family.
The picture I get is he's a very difficult man to work out. Probably didn't have any very close friends. Probably didn't discuss a lot of personal matters with a lot of people.
Pat always seemed to be shy of cameras. There's, I've got here a history of the Tauranga IRD over the 75 years, and there isn't a picture of Pat in it.
The background inquiries pulled up that maybe he wasn't very happy with Colonel Carpendale, the father-in-law. They also showed that maybe he wasn't very enamoured of the fact that he was about to have a fifth child. One person suggested that he wasn't entirely happy with his life in New Zealand after a very adventuresome young life.
If Pat Fisk had left the country, he would most likely have departed from a nearby East Coast port. We begin our new inquiry into Pat Fisk's disappearance by exploring the theory that he fled the country. Investigator Scott Bainbridge first checked the shipping timetables. The records show that the only port which had ships leaving for overseas on the 6th of December 1956 and the days just after that was the port of Tauranga, Pat's hometown. Hobson's account of the conversation at the quarry showed that Pat had a good knowledge of ring bolting.
Yeah, the term ring bolting was given to when you would hide somebody away on a vessel and take them over to Australia without anybody knowing about it. They used to also call it stowing away, stowaways, and they used to go mainly out through the port of Mount Maunganui. There was no security as such there. There was no gates, there was no fences, and it was very easy to walk on board a ship, hide yourself, or have somebody hide you, and you could stow away and end up going to wherever the vessel was going.
Pat had worked on the wharves in Tauranga and Mount Maunganui, so he probably could have got onto a ship easily if he'd wanted to.
He would have come up the gangway 2, 3, 4 in the morning, hidden himself in an engine room or down in a hatch or somewhere where he couldn't be seen, and just wandered off the ship when he got to Sydney, and nobody would have known in those days.
If Pat Fisk had staged his disappearance, he'd gone to very elaborate lengths to leave the IRD car in a strange state. He would also have needed someone else's help to get back to Tauranga, over 150 kilometres away.
There was another suggestion that a woman had picked up Pat Fisk near the saddle and had driven off. It's one of those stories that just no one knows, but it does fit with the theory of him disappearing.
In 2002, Chris Douglas discovered a new lead. One of the Fisk's neighbours, Mrs. McMonigal, claimed that Pat was alive and well and living in Australia in the 1960s.
Mrs. McMonigal, not a regular attender of the movies, went to the movies, sitting through the short movies first. There was a documentary about Australia on it. Part of the documentary showed a person marshalling aircraft, ping pong bat man, as he was called in those days, somewhere in the outback of Australia. And Mrs. McMonigal apparently cried out in the movies, "There's Pat Fisk."
Chris's inquiries revealed that the Australian documentary was called The Painted Country.
The one living person who did go to the movie said Mrs. McGonigal was very, very adamant that it was Pat Fisk in the movie.
If the film can be found, this could possibly prove Pat was still alive in 1961.
Bear in mind she had been his neighbour for quite some time, knew him quite well, and she apparently thereafter said there's no mystery about Pat Fisk's disappearance anymore. He's in Australia and he did a runner.
One of Pat Fisk's neighbours claimed to have seen him in an Australian film 5 years after he disappeared. Investigator Scott Bainbridge has been searching for the film and discovered that neither the Australian nor New Zealand film archives have a copy of The Painted Country. The film's producer, Roderick Johnston, is not listed in any Australian phone book and may well be dead. Advertisements have been placed in Australian newspapers to see if anyone knows Roderick Johnston or has a copy of this old film. Scott is going to find out what Pat might have looked like in 1961. Today, police often use facial reconstruction technology to aid in identifying people, but they are not normally asked to work on cases that are over 50 years old.
There was an alleged sighting of Pat in 1961 in a movie. He would have been aged about 42 by then. Are you able to show me the difference from when he was 37 to 5 years later when he was 42?
Right. I'm going to go for the forehead now because he's got quite a smooth forehead. First of all, I get the smile lines, and that's these, like crow's feet.
And this photo of when he was 37, it looks
Yes.
like
he has crow's feet there with the smiling. That's aged him completely.
That seems to be quite a significant change in just 5 years.
Depending on the climate and where he was and what kind of lifestyle he had. So if he's in a dry area, his skin's going to suffer.
Now we want to see what Pat might look like if he is still alive today.
I've changed his hair. I've moved his hairline right up. The brow lines, worry lines, have been made a lot darker. Around his eyes, I've given more shadow and more smile lines, as you can see here. There we are. That's aged considerably to what he may look like. And also, I've got another picture here. There he is with glasses. Because as you get older, your eyesight deteriorates.
What doesn't change in a person's facial characteristics?
That'll be the bone structure of the face. Also, if you look at the iris of the eyes, that colour will stay the same, but bone structure stays the same.
The adverts in the Australian newspapers have paid off. Roderick Johnston, the producer of the film The Painted Country, has made contact.
Hello?
Yeah, g'day. I was wondering whether I can talk to Rod Johnston, please.
Speaking.
G'day, Mr. Johnston. It's Scott Bainbridge here from Screen Time in New Zealand.
Oh, yes.
Roderick remembers shooting the film back in 1961, and fortunately he still has a copy stored away in his garage.
In perfect order, there's no doubt about that.
This is the film that one of Pat Fisk's neighbours claims to have seen him in 5 years after his disappearance.
The people that believe they saw Mr. Fisk on your film believe that they saw him in the background waving down an airplane with table tennis bats.
Oh, yeah, that's at the airport. Yes,
At the airport,
yes,
right.
yes, yes.
Right, so you can recall that?
Oh, well, yeah, and vague, very vague. These are ground crew that would be guiding the plane into the terminal.
Roderick was happy to lend us the original negative of the film. We sent it to a professional lab to process, but after 50 years of being stored in a garage, it has deteriorated. Almost all the colour has faded and humidity has caused serious water damage. But we can identify which man Mrs. McMonigal claimed was Pat Fisk.
It's very difficult to say whether he'd adopted a new name or not if he had left the country. But certainly when it comes to pension time, it's very difficult to prove one's antecedents unless you stick to the truth. But all Australian states and the government said no record at all in anywhere there. Checked birth, deaths and marriages Australia for death records, not recorded anywhere.
A film archivist has used new digital technology to enhance one of the film's frames. By matching and restoring missing colour, the image is now much clearer. However, there is no angle where the man faces the camera. Maureen and her daughters will be the best judges of the damaged film. They're understandably anxious about seeing the images, but only they can truly say whether the man in the footage is their missing husband and father.
Can't tell who it is.
So that's all you've got?
That's all there is on that film of the people that said that they saw Pat. We've been able to enhance a still image.
Pat was a much better physique than that. That's a skinny man. Now but physique is not Pat at all. Look at his skinny legs. It's not. Couldn't possibly be Pat. He was such a lovely, muscular physique. He was a lovely man.
We can't rule out that Pat absconded, but Maureen is confident that the person marshalling the plane at Alice Springs is not her husband, Pat. Oddly, there was a man working at the airport at that time called David Fisk. Further investigations revealed that he was in no way related to Pat Fisk. There is no firm proof that Pat staged his own disappearance. Another theory is that he may have wandered into the bush, got lost, or had an accident. We have assembled a team of search and rescue experts to work on Pat Fisk's disappearance. Before any formal search, all possibilities are considered. Initially, the team works from information that searchers would have had on the day Pat Fisk was reported missing in 1956.
Yeah, Ray, I think we've got to consider foul play. The guy was a tax inspector and, people generally don't like being followed around by the IRD.
OK, that's one. What's some others?
A staged disappearance. We don't know what's driving him or driven him to go to that spot.
Lost in the bush around the vicinity of the car. That's probably one of the big ones.
He didn't have a lot of experience in that area or in bush, so yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Each scenario is now given a percentage weighting. This allows the best allocation of resources for a search and rescue operation. These results indicate a high probability that Pat got lost or had an accident in the bush.
Right at the beginning, being lost had to be a reasonably high probability scenario, and things such as searching from the vehicle, that he could have gone missing, gone for a walk, freshen up, something like that, the fact he could have gone to the toilet, any of those things had to be checked out.
So the team, using modern technology, plan a new ground search for clues at the Tarapanamu summit where the car was found. If it was Pat Fisk who drove the car here, it appears he stopped to have lunch and admire the view. One of the unusual features of Pat Fisk's disappearance was the state in which the IRD car had been left. The driver's door was wide open and the keys were missing.
How the car was left is very, very strange. Pat Fisk's lunch was missing, which means probably that he'd consumed it. Pat Fisk's thermos was found in the front seat of the car, and alongside the thermos was a cup of tea which had been partially consumed. Now that suggests very strongly that here's a man having his lunch, something has come along to disturb him, and he's put down his cup of tea and walked away.
No, Pat would never have left the car like that. He was a very responsible person. If for any reason he had had to leave the car, he'd have locked it and left a note or something.
Search and rescue have identified the most likely trails Pat would have taken given the terrain and bush growth in 1956.
Okay guys, we're just going to do a purposeful wandering search through that face from the old track here down through the gully. If you happen to find anything, stop the line and we'll investigate it from there with the team leader.
They're looking for any clues, a lunch pail, personal items, especially leather from shoes, a watch, or possibly even bone fragments.
When he went on these trips, I used to lend him my little gold watch. And it looked ridiculous on his great big wrist, my little lady's gold watch. And this was one of the things the police got onto. You wouldn't believe. They sort of made it sound as if he must be queer in some way, that he'd wear a lady's watch. But anyway, if a body was found, it might have a gold watch on it.
After a day in the bush around the Tarapanamu summit, search and rescue have not uncovered any new clues. The team now carry out a new assessment of what might have happened to Pat Fisk based on the result of their search and the findings of the 1957 police report.
If he hadn't been there, the chances of him being lost in the bush are 0.
Lost in the bush has declined, and staged disappearance is now favoured as the most likely scenario.
A staged disappearance has to be a reasonable proposition. The police reports favoured it. There's no firm evidence to say to the contrary, and you'd have to leave it there as a likely thing to have happened. One of the interesting things here with the scenario is looking at a timeline of his life, and in virtually every year and a half to 2.5 years, there's a significant change in what he does, and so that time has turned up again. That's one of the things that could sort of put a slight weighting on the staged disappearance.
Maureen and the Fisk family believe the original police report was biased in favour of information suggesting Pat had abandoned his family, and that in 1956 police failed to investigate the possibility of foul play thoroughly enough.
Because no body was found, they didn't accept that, or it seemed to me that they weren't bothered about that, or really tried to investigate that as a possibility.
In 2002, the family was able to get the case re-investigated.
They sent an inspector, Chris Douglas. He said there's no doubt the case had been very badly, what did he say, very sloppily handled.
The last person known to have spoken to Fisk was Reg Hobson. Reg was the foreman and the man with the blasting ticket at the Peki Peki quarry.
Hobson was known as a bit of a character and even had a colourful nickname, Mickey Spillane.
Well, he was always extremely neat, and I think he wore a Panama hat and always at a rakish angle. Yes, he was almost dapper, I would describe him. He was a good friend, but you wouldn't want him for an enemy.
He was very well known in the area as a man who went to the pub, had a few beers, occasionally got a little bit angry. If someone annoyed him, there'd be a bit of a fist fight, all sorted out with a few fists. He had a few previous convictions, including some for minor assault.
The Peki Peki quarry is still in operation, but it's not as busy as when Reg Hobson worked here in 1956. As Hobson, aka Mickey Spillane, was the last person to talk to Pat Fisk, suspicion initially fell on him.
The boys came to the tea table one night and it was just buzzing. Mickey that particular day was setting charges. And then they said they never saw the Inland Revenue man again. He disappeared, the rocks came down. Everybody was going nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I think Mickey's, put him under the rocks. Like they just said it out straight up. Mickey's done it.
But with so many potential witnesses at the quarry, it would have been difficult for Hobson to get away with murder.
There were, I understand, 4 or 5 people working in the quarry, as well as 2 trucks, maybe 3 trucks, continuously in and out, carting material to the roads. The chances of the body being buried, picked up, put through the crusher, and spread in little bits on the road is very, very slim.
However, Heather Stowe recalls Hobson acting very strangely after Pat disappeared.
So Mickey called him to stay and we had a cup of tea. We're chatting away. He never stayed long. And I just said jokingly, because we're always joshing each other, everybody did, took the Mickey as they say. And I said, "Hey Mickey, what have you done with that revenue man?" And I sort of looked up and his face was absolutely fierce. It was just frozen. And I just felt a little chill go up the back of my neck and I thought, this is an oops moment. He just held my gaze. And then he just pushed his cup across the table, stood up and walked out the door. I never saw Mickey again. He never came in for another cup of tea.
Hobson continued living in the Murupara area until the 1970s when he retired. He passed away in the early 80s. Search and rescue expert Ross Gordon and investigator Scott Bainbridge are meeting at the Peki Peki quarry to explore the murder theory.
One of 2 things happened. That he did get in his car and leave the quarry and go on further away, or he was killed here.
Ross gives his search and rescue analysis of the terrain as if a murder had happened here.
What we've got is a valley, and within that valley we've got a quarry. We would probably make use of trackers and we would go right round the outside edge of the quarry. So what the searchers would be looking for, if there was any activity going outside, such as a person walking to dispose of something, which could have been a murder weapon if that happened, or firearm, or in fact taking a body.
There is only one road the IRD car could have taken back to Murupara that day. Along the way, Ross observes possible locations for hiding Pat if he'd been murdered at the quarry and transported elsewhere.
Have a look straight down through here now. It's unlikely that someone would stop and drop a body off the side of the road. It's not a good look to be pulled on the side of the road dropping a body. So they often go off into side roads, rest areas, beside bridges, waterways is a common spot. And they would be the area that the search teams would be going in to look. 80% of the bodies will be found within 50 metres of the side of the road. Out to 100, 150 metres, pretty much 100% of the bodies. And I think Pat was 6'1", 6'2", and powerfully built. You'd need someone strong to be able to do that.
The next sighting of the IRD car was in Murupara, about 10 kilometres away, at around 12:30. Here there is conflicting evidence to weigh up. One witness was local publican Mrs. Fell.
She specifically noted the government plates on the car, saw a person driving. That person had a Panama hat on, and that person was quite large build, but not known to her.
I saw this 53, 54 Velox driving past at a distance of no more than 20 to 50 feet at the most. He wore a Panama hat, but this particular time he didn't have his hat on, he had the hat sitting on the dash.
Pat Fisk did not wear a hat. Reg Hobson, however, was known to often wear his Panama hat. Mystery still surrounds the last sightings of Pat Fisk and his IRD car. One witness claimed it was Pat driving. The other said the driver was wearing a Panama hat. Pat didn't wear a Panama hat, but quarry manager Reg Hobson did.
When we asked about the Panama hat and the person that she'd seen in the car, she was quite clear and adamant that it was definitely not Hobson. She would have recognised him.
There's no mistaking that I'd seen the car and the gentleman in it, and I'd be fairly sure it was Fisk.
So there is confusion over the Panama hat, and who exactly was driving the IRD car cannot be verified for certain. Fellow workers maintained that Reg Hobson was having lunch at the quarry at 12:30. This supports Mrs. Fell's statement that Hobson was not driving the IRD car through Murupara. However, Mrs. Fell also told Chris Douglas that Hobson had ring-bolted to Australia before to avoid paying tax.
Chances of Hobson killing him, there really wasn't any reason for Hobson to kill him. When you get down to it, owing a little bit of tax, having been as free and open as he was about confessing about other tax, it's not really an option.
Unless Hobson was involved in a ring-bolting racket. One strange thing is that if it was Pat Fisk driving the car, he never stopped at the Murupara Hotel to book a room, as he told his wife Maureen he would do. Our new investigations into Pat's disappearance have become widely known amongst his old community, and a man who identified himself only as George contacted us. He claims to have new information. George was very cagey and only agreed to meet in a car park. He said that in the 1960s he worked with a man that confessed to knowing Pat Fisk's killer.
He seemed to be adamant that he knew exactly what had happened to the bloke and all the rest of it.
What did he actually say?
He was boasting about the fact that, they'll never find that joker. He's buried in the skid site. It wouldn't be very hard for the bulldozer to dispose of somebody after he'd been cleared on the head with an axe or something.
Did Mr. Matheson say why his boss killed the taxman?
No, he never mentioned anything like that. It was just the fact that, I know what's happened to him and he'll never be found sort of business.
And you think he's perhaps buried up at the skid site?
Well, that's what he said.
George's information is scant, and it could be a hoax. But he did suggest White's Clearing, a location close to where Pat Fisk's car was later found, as a place where there are many skid sites. The man George claims to have talked to was Alan Matheson. Matheson is dead now, and his widow has no idea who her husband's boss was back in 1956. White's Clearing is a massive area, some 50 square kilometres. George believes this is the place where Pat may have met his death. George talked of skid sites, points where logs are collected and loaded onto trucks. There were many in this area, but they are all covered over now. White's Clearing is well past the summit, and the odometer showed that the IRD car drove only as far as the summit. So if Pat was killed here, he would have to have been brought here by someone else. In the late 1990s, police searched White's Clearing for another investigation and went over the ground with a metal detector. Nothing found in that search was linked to the disappearance of Pat Fisk. If George's story of a logging gang being involved in Pat's murder is true, we need more information. Search and Rescue do a final scenario analysis based on our investigation and interviews. After the search at the summit, and based on the information in the 1957 police report, staged disappearance was favoured as the most likely possibility. But the latest analysis produces a remarkably different outcome. Search and Rescue now favour foul play as the most likely scenario to explain the disappearance of Pat Fisk.
In the absence of concrete, hard evidence, it is working with probabilities. The loss scenario has dropped. Therefore, there has to be some other logical explanation, and foul play has to be in there. There are some things that have happened. For instance, the vehicle like that, with the door open, the cup of tea and so forth set up like that. I can't think of another search where that's actually happened. It's just really unusual. Some of the overseas thinking is that when we get operations like this now, we should, if in doubt, think murder. That's the way of, we should just do that as one of the scenarios.
Well, I feel it vindicates us because I have known all along it had to be foul play. And it was just so frustrating when the police didn't adequately look into that.
At this stage, however, Pat Fisk remains one of the missing.
I would really like to know what happened. I'd like to be able to find his body so we could at least bury him. And I think it would be good for all the family to have closure on what happened to their dad.